To the webinar. I'm Teresa Gorman, Senior Associate for Local News at the Democracy Fund. If you came to hear about funding and mapping local news ecosystems, you're in the right place. For those of you joining online, can you do me a favor? Can you write in the comments where it says chat in the lower right if you can hear me? And this is a secret ploy. Okay, I see some awesome comments saying that you can hear me. Now you know where to put your comments and questions through the webinar. So for folks that are joining us online, that's the place for you to share your thoughts, your insights, your questions throughout. If you're joining us via phone, you can send us questions via email at localnewslab@democracyfund.org. I can't guarantee we'll get to them today, but we'll definitely get to them in the future. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have colleagues you want to send it to, or you want to check it out again in the future, you will be able to. And it looks like we're getting a bunch of folks, so let's get going. Today we're going to be talking about assessing your local news ecosystem from the author of a new toolkit that Democracy Fund recently released, Fiona Morgan. Fiona is going to share a few highlights of the new toolkit, which you can find at ecosystems.democracyfund.org. And we're super thrilled to have some great guests who are going to share their own experiences and learnings navigating this kind of crazy landscape. Molly Jaguar of the Independence Public Media Foundation. Hi, Molly. And Lamont Guillory of the Lore Foundation. Hi, Lamont. We're joining you from across the country. So really excited for this discussion. And we definitely left lots of time for conversation and questions. So please get those in now. And I'm looking at the list of people joining us. It looks like we also have some people joining who are also doing some really cool things across the country. So if you want to share your own insights, feedback, questions from your own experiences, I know that you know where the comment place is to do that, so please do that throughout. Before moving to Fiona, I did want to just give a quick background to share why we created this guide, why we are having people come together on the Friday afternoon before Thanksgiving to have this conversation, and why we think it's so important, and then we'll kind of take it away. So at Democracy Fund, we know that local news and information is vital for a healthy democracy. It's right there in the name, which is why we fund local news around the country in partnership with some great local and place-based funders who I think some of them are joining us today. But we know that whether you're a journalism funder or not a journalism funder, whatever your issue is, that journalism, news and information, quality information is important to your communities. So now we know that that is happening across the country. And we've also heard from foundations and philanthropists that they know that, they agree, they say, yes, I agree. But how do we get started? We know that we have a role to play, but we don't really know how to navigate this world. There's lots of great resources out there from folks at the Knight Foundation, from folks at Media Impact Funders, and from many others, including our awesome guests today. But we wanted to share more about what we've learned at Democracy Fund through this toolkit and through our partnerships with folks that are on the phone. We've learned a lot through assessments and funding and different mapping that we've done in places like North Carolina, New Mexico, New Jersey. And we really just wanted to share what we've learned, but we've also wanted to hear from others about what they've learned. So it really brings a lot of that together to help gather the information you need to really take that informed action to improve your ecosystem. There's way more always that we could share. So really looking forward to seeing kind of what else people want to learn and what else they want to share with each other. We really think that undertaking some type of learning before getting started or while you're doing the work is super important, because there's not one solution to what's happening in local news. We know that there's many different solutions, and taking this ecosystem way of doing things can really help look at all the different opportunities, gaps, and fund across the whole region. So really beginning to see ways that we can work together and ground solutions in many different ways. So by being really thoughtful, informed, and starting with people, we know that we can really make local news more resilient and sustainable, and in turn, our communities more healthy. So that's the spiel about why this is super important. But we're going to move to Fiona to share more kind of what she's learned through this process and what she's been doing kind of out in the country by creating this toolkit. We've been so lucky to work with Fiona Morgan on this work. She's an esteemed former journalist, academic who is kind of amazing at this work and has a lot of thoughts to share. So I'm going to move it over to Fiona to give us a little more information. And I will unmute Fiona. Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be talking to you about this, my favorite topic, which is building local news ecosystems to make our democracy and our communities stronger. So thanks so much to Teresa and Democracy Fund, and thanks a lot also to Lamont and Molly who are here with us, and to many of the other people on this call and many other people in the field that I've been able to work with. So I'm going to try to use the time well and just go over what is in the toolkit. So to give you, without reading off everything, because there's a lot of text, so I don't want to overwhelm you, but I want to just sort of show you around what's here because we put a lot in this. I'm going to share my screen, so hold on, bear with me for just a second. Let's see if I can remember how to do that. Okay. There, great. Okay, so a little bit of background. As Teresa mentioned, I've been working with Democracy Fund on this work, and what we kind of are doing here is reverse engineering some of the ways that I have done some assessments, including in North Carolina and now in other parts of the country as well. So what you'll see when you go to ecosystems.democracyfund.org is the homepage. We're pleased to have a lot of really interesting photos that I can't take credit for that are from various convenings and workshops and other things that have been going on that Democracy Fund's been part of. Give you just, so if at any point you just want to look at the PDF version or have something to print out, you can always hit download guide, and that'll take you to the handy PDF version, which is beautiful. But I'm going to walk, and you should definitely be subscribing to these if you're not already. This guide has some good overview. We've tried to make it interactive and take advantage of the fact that it's online. The general sections are describing what a news ecosystem is, and there's a lot of ways to define it, of course, but Democracy Fund has what I think is a very effective and flexible and actionable way of thinking about it. We have ways to think about your research, how to go about it, how to think big picture about what it is that you really want to know. Section 3 is really a deep dive into a lot of methods. There's a lot of free data sources in here. So one of the big takeaways I hope that you'll get from this is that it does not have to cost a lot of money to do this work. You do not need to buy a lot of data or information. There's a lot that you can just sort of do on your own and really tailor to your own needs and what you want to learn. Act on what you've learned is where we walk through various ways that you can take this. The whole point of doing these assessments isn't just to create a report that you put on the shelf or have some light reading, right? It's to take action, it's to do something useful. So that's what Section 4 is about. And right size your assessment is our attempt to sort of give some possible recipes we know that capacity varies, and we know that time varies and other kinds of resources. So this was just a way of thinking about different ways to do this. I also want to highlight these case studies that we'll talk about. These are 4 different places where philanthropic funders have had an active role in local news ecosystems. two of which we'll hear about today. And the resources section, I'm going to skip ahead and look at that real quick because I think it's really important, and I think that we're going to be adding to it as we go, including adding this recording of this webinar and other kinds of resources. So you'll find a lot of background, other studies that have been done, other places where this work is ongoing that may not be featured in the case studies, but still may be good. And those are people that you can reach out to too. All this stuff is sort of happening right now, and there's a lot of sharing and collaboration going on. So let me go back up to the sections just briefly to walk you through what's there. So again, what is a news ecosystem? We have a lot of what we hope are simple, understandable ways of describing this. So you could describe this to your colleagues and stakeholders. And some of these are just questions that are good conversation starters. We think of news ecosystems much more broadly than just conventional media. We are thinking really broadly about really putting people at the center, as Teresa said, and trying to think about how do people in a community get news and information about where they live and how they make decisions and how they keep their communities healthy. When you start your research, we wanted to have some ways of thinking about that. So one is to get to know your community, to really look at the overview. We're thinking a lot about representation. Racial equity is a big concern in media, as in all things in civic life. And so we wanted to think about how can we look at who's here and are their voices heard? We also look at need and infrastructure. How do we determine that? So need is what's missing, but infrastructure is what's there. And then listen and share. So this is some information about ways to use engagement, both as part of the research and as part of the way that you make that research speak to the community and build something. And then making sense of it all is how you pull it together for something that you can share and act on. I want to quickly go through section 3 because, like I said, there's a tremendous amount of information in here, and it's not here to overwhelm you. You absolutely do not have to do everything that's in here to do a good assessment. But I wanted to point out that throughout this toolkit, we have these little pull down menus that you'll see here called Try It. So these are kind of like little test digs or little mini assignments. So these are things that you can do, and it gives you a sense of how much time is this going to take? How does this work? What am I going to find? And you can sort of pull together these different little mini assignments and just give it a shot and see if this is the kind of information that's useful to you. And so throughout this all, we have, again, information that is accessible online, that you can search. It's constantly being updated. And we are looking and including things like searching the FCC website, which if you've ever done it, it's not real easy to do. So we have some very concrete things that you can do to look for specific stuff and ways that you can poke around and find things. So there's a tremendous amount, like I said, there's a lot of data. And even in areas where there may not be, we definitely include Hispanic, Spanish language media, Black-owned media, and all kinds of Alana media. Alana, somebody can fill me in, but it's a variety of ethnic and foreign language and other kinds of community media. And we want to broaden our sense of what media is, but there may not be like an easy database for that or an easy data set, but there's still lots of ways that you can get to it. And lastly, the last two sections, act on what you've learned. Again, we have really great examples of things that other folks have done to try to figure out how do we take this work, socialize it, make it actionable, and bring people along with us so that we can make the ecosystem stronger. And then the last section here is to right size your assessment. So like I said, we're going to be adding to the resources page. As Teresa said, the whole mindset of this is to center the people in your community and how they receive news and information. And a lot of what we're trying to think about too is not just what's missing, but what are you building on and who are you building with? So that's a big part, I know, of what Molly and Lamont will say. We're looking not just for what's declined or what's not present, but who and which institutions are specific and unique to your community that's going to make this work really possible and make it sustainable and make it really community oriented. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Teresa.
Awesome. Thanks, Fiona. I love that point. I think that this week and almost every week, there's a lot of bad news about the future of local news. But if you dive into this toolkit or just talk to some of the people that are on this call, both panelists and attendees, you'll be inspired by what people are doing and what we can envision and transform the future to be. So that's my plug, to be positive sometimes. But super excited to share a little more with Molly and Lamont. I think we are always constantly learning from both of these folks, and really excited to have them joining us today. We'll start out with Molly. So Molly, we talked a lot about your work in New Jersey with the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. And I think Fiona called you like one of the, I forget, the first people to be doing this and thinking about this in the statewide way. So really led a lot of this work along with Megan Van Dyke and many others. So really interested to hear a lot of some of your thoughts. So thanks for joining us, and let me actually unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, awesome.
All right, thank you so much, Teresa and Fiona and Lamont. Happy Friday. I'm super excited to be in this conversation because I think this toolkit is just an incredible resource, and I feel very honored to be a part of it. So, Teresa, you had asked me a little bit about the Center for Cooperative Media in New Jersey, and to talk a little bit about sort of what led to that decision, and how it was successful. So I'll try to give a very brief overview of it. The Center for Cooperative Media is sort of this centralized hub of services and support for journalists and news outlets across New Jersey. And one of the things I would say about New Jersey is that it's kind of a weird media landscape because it's sandwiched between New York and Philadelphia media markets. And so actually there's not a lot of local news in New Jersey. If you live in South Jersey, you get Philadelphia news. If you live in North Jersey, you get New York news. There's no like NBC or CBS or ABC in New Jersey. That doesn't exist. There's no local broadcast affiliate in New Jersey. So we saw that blank slate as an opportunity to build up. And our first grant was really to establish the Center for Cooperative Media. And in a lot of ways, that grant was purely practical, which is that we had our original budget, this was back in like 2011, 2012, was about $250,000. And at the time, a lot of funders were funding like reporters, right? They were funding beats, specific issue areas. And our sense was, well, if we did that, we could maybe fund one or two reporters for a whole state, and that wasn't going to get us very far. And we also had this idea that we were trying to lift up the whole ecosystem in New Jersey, a statewide approach. And so we helped found the Center for Cooperative Media. And I think, what it has done over the course of 7 or so years now is nothing short of remarkable. And that's a real reflection of the people who have led that at various stages. There have been 3 different leaders of the Center for Cooperative Media, and they've each brought their own sort of talents and expertise to it. And I think what it's done is it's created a shared sense of identity and a sense of community and belonging in New Jersey. It's helped bring together the New Jersey community of journalists in a way, and out of the shadows of New York and Philadelphia. And I think some of the key elements of this work that have made it successful is, well, for one thing, everyone was looking for the help, right? Like everybody would love to have someone out there whose existence is to serve and support your professional needs. And we were very specific about the center not being in competition with any news outlets. So they don't produce news stories. They are there to serve news outlets and journalists across the state. They're responsive to what the journalists say they need. They reach out frequently and say, how can we help you? What are you struggling with? Sometimes when they see patterns emerging, they will, like there may be patterns emerging around needing IT help or needing help around crafting better Freedom of Information Act requests, things like that. They will develop workshops and training. They provide valuable research and trends to help keep New Jersey sort of ahead of the curve as best they can. And I just think overall they've really built and maintained trust over time, and they've built and maintained collaboration and camaraderie. So it was a way to make a grant that really benefited everybody rather than one or two news outlets. And it has really exceeded our wildest expectations for it. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is just that it took, I don't want to pretend like it was easy to do this work. It took 3 full years before we felt like the center was on pretty solid ground. And there were many times in those first 3 years where we worried about it sort of all falling apart. And we had, we started thinking about, well, what does a plan B look like if it falls apart? And, I think it's really important to know that you have to stick with these things for a while to see the progress that you hope to see.
Thanks, Molly. I think that's always very helpful to hear that this is a long process. Even though we have created, there's lots more people to share learnings these days. It's still a long process, but there's lots of things you can do along the way. And I'll mention one thing is that about the toolkit itself. So Fiona kind of pulled out that learning and shared there's a kind of find a center of gravity recommendation, because that came up both with the work in New Jersey, but in a lot of places, just the need for finding someone that can make those connections. So thanks for making that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe someone will come up with a magic wand, but not us. So you've been doing this work for a while in New Jersey and now kind of evolved into work in Philadelphia. If there was one piece of advice that you wanted to kind of leave us with, is there one thing you would share to a kind of fellow funder who's exploring this and thinking about doing something like this?
Yeah, definitely. And I apologize if I think I might have said something similar to this in the toolkit, but I think maybe it's a reflection of how much I believe in it. But, where I have seen the greatest impact over time is by investing in people and organizations who themselves are network builders, and giving them additional money to experiment and get creative, and giving them a real, just giving them the opportunity to helping unleash their creativity and see what they do. I mean, I think we have seen that in New Jersey in ways that I just have been astounded by. And it is just a lesson that I've carried with me ever since, because it made a real difference in New Jersey.
Do you, that's a great point. Do you have any thoughts about how to find the network builders?
I mean, that's a good question. I think part of it is just like when you're getting to learn about the people, when you're sort of starting to do mapping, or a lot of funders sort of already know lots of leaders in their communities already, right? And I was looking for people who boy, how do I put this? They are good connectors. They connect people, they connect ideas. And, you see them as being people. When you start to see people who start connecting themselves to lots of other people and organizations that you know they didn't necessarily know, like in the beginning. And let me just give an example, because I feel like I'm not being super clear here, but we made a grant to the Center for Investigative Reporting in their national organization, but we asked them to come to New Jersey because we wanted them to help build more collaboration among New Jersey news organizations. And we had seen them do some really creative storytelling experiments in their work nationally. And we thought, well, maybe we can help do that in New Jersey too. And so we asked CIR to come, and they did a number of convenings. They really got people excited about the idea of collaborating. And over time, they've done a number of collaborations in New Jersey, including a theater piece, a comedy show, a student reporting contest. I think there have been some others, but what was astonishing to me was when I was at one point working with my board to say, this is the impact that I have seen by bringing CIR in. What I realized was that CIR had networked together 18 other Dodge grantees across all of our program areas, from arts, education, and environment, as well as connected to our poetry program. So they had done this incredible networking. They saw all the organizations we were working with and said, let's bring all these people together and work towards something bigger. And I think part of that was just having seen CIR do that work elsewhere and knowing that they were good at being network builders. And so, it's kind of hard to articulate exactly how to go about spotting those people, but they just did a remarkable job.
That's great. Thank you. And actually, I think that really connects with a little bit of what Lamont is going to talk about. So I'll move to Lamont, and then we can have time for a Q&A. So I'm going to unmute Lamont. Okay, great. So in terms of I think that there's a lot of connection between this work, but there's also some differences, which is why I'm glad that both of you are on today. So Lohr Foundation doesn't serve one state. It serves kind of a whole region in the Mountain West, which is pretty big. And a lot of this work that you talk about in the case study, you partnered with the Solutions Journalism Network to do some of that ecosystem building and finding the people who are the network builders and really doing a lot of that engagement. And they also had to work within both rural and urban areas. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that work and any challenges or learnings that you had in that way, Lamont?
Before I dive in order to be on this panel, at least 50% of us have to be in a scarf. So that was the qualifier. Winter is upon us. And so what I'll speak to you, to the audience today is about the regional approach, right? And so for us, it was the logical next step in the progression of the work. The first part of our work with Solutions Journalism Network launched with a report. And that report was called the Mountain West News Desert, right? And that was an assessment. We needed an assessment first. And so based on that assessment, we then created two groups. And those two groups produced a series of packages. And those groups were located in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The one in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado was called Small Towns, Big Change. And in Montana, it was called the Montana Gap. And as we looked at both, we really looked at the articles. And, we start to see some crossover. The communities, the people, culture in each state are diverse, as is every rural community. But the issues they were talking about and tackling, they weren't necessarily all that different. And so the approach to solving community problems were. They were innovative, they were entrepreneurial, they were inspiring. And so we started to think, could this positive reporting, these real tangible ideas where community had to address the problems facing their community, be shared and amplified elsewhere? And we thought so. And but how could we share them? How can we share them throughout the region? And how can that be done at a grassroots level? How can it remain authentic and not feel like it was something that is being produced? Um, and, and how can it be done at a grassroots level and be done by the very people that wrote them, right? That was the authentic piece for us from our perspective. And so this is where the idea of the Mountain West News Partnership for us accelerated. I mean, we've long had this vision for it, but this was like the point where it crystallized for us and started to accelerate. And so, we thought about creating a way in which these journalists could interact with one another and share stories at any point in the reporting process. That was a critical piece. Now, how can we actually do this? And let me tell everyone on the webinar today, we're still doing this. It's a happening. It's an ing. And so how can we do this? And so from there, the foundation leaned heavily on the expertise of our grantee and partner Solutions Journalism Network. And so in this evolution of the work, we're about 1 year into this body of work. And there's some, we're seeing some positive things happening. There's a Mountain West story tracker. That story tracker houses all of the solution stories in one searchable spot for journalists and the public. There's a newsletter that curates the articles, and it sends them to the journalists in the region on a regular basis. We have office hours, webinars for the journalists. We have someone heading up this regional newsroom concept, and they're available for office hours to provide support. That's a valuable asset for the ecosystem. Molly, you touched on this earlier, but we have what we call solution spotters. And these solution spotters are just starting for us now. We're just launching this part of it. But it's about recruiting local advocates to be the ears on the ground and to feed information back to the newsroom ecosystem on what they're hearing on the ground. And so we're really hopeful about this part of the work. And then early in part of 2020, we'll be bringing journalists together to have an in-person meeting. And then there's some vision for next steps of the iteration of the SJN work. I want to put an asterisk by this next piece, and it's philanthropy's role. We have all these stories at various levels of the solution process, most of which are in the very beginning stages of the solution, right? And the question I have is, how can foundations play a role in accelerating those solutions? The needs are very real. There's huge opportunity here for the philanthropic community to look at these solution stories, identify who's playing a role, and then start to think about whom might I engage with, partner with, to bring solutions or bring more funding, more services, more resources to what's already been identified on the ground. I really believe this is the sweet spot. Laura is really excited about this part of the work. So if anyone on the line is wanting to have a deeper conversation about, Lamont, how do I what's my on-ramp? I did a webinar before with Fiona about on-ramps. This is your on-ramp. And the second piece is more community engagement. We like to see more grassroots engagement between the community and media outlets. And how can we take the solution spotter concept and broaden it and encourage more dialogue between locals and reporters? I was just at a conference about a month ago in Mansfield, Ohio, and it was put on by Solutions Journalism Network, but it was hosted by Richland Source. And Richland Source did a phenomenal job of becoming this community engagement hub where people no longer felt like they were being reported on, but they were part of the reporting process. And now they've become this community engagement hub. They throw parties, they throw social events, they did a mayoral debate while we were there, they threw a Halloween party. They are actually part of the fabric of the community. And I found that very compelling and very optimistic about the future of local journalism on that community engagement part.
Ooh, yeah, I love that. more journalists throwing parties for communities.
That's right.
Let's do it. I think the on-ramp thing is a big one. I think even in this webinar, we've been kind of throwing words around that if you don't know the journalism world, you're probably a little confused. So it takes a while to like get involved and get into it. Do you have any kind of one piece of advice for funders that are just starting to figure this out?
If they're on this phone, they're doing the right step, and that's listen. With anything, listen first, digest that information, figure out a way how you might be in a position to start to elevate those thoughts, and then move to action, which we call at Lore Foundation Accelerate. And when you hit the accelerate part, I want everyone to know that you don't have to do this alone. There has been a significant amount of work that's already been tested. There's been successes, there's been failures, there's been challenges. That work has been done. And so I think it's now the opportunity for the entire ecosystem to start building more on-ramps for other organizations to participate. That would be my advice.
That's a good one. So we have about 20 minutes of time for kind of conversation and questions. So I'm going to remind folks to use the chat box and put your questions in there.
If you don't mind, before we move on, there was, I've listed all these, successes and the steps that we're taking, but I also want to highlight just quickly, and Molly said it earlier, there's some challenges along the way, and I just want to highlight a few of them. Part of some of the challenges in our assessment was, part of the work, current work with SJN includes increasing volume of solution stories, reporting in the region. And with that goal comes the need for additional reporters, right? And so when we looked at the challenge of filling that need, of adding positions to newsrooms, we invited Report for America to be a part of this work, right? We used Report for America's business model, their fellowship program, and starting to figure out how we can create on-ramps for other business models to come and join in on this work to fill gaps on the ground. And Report for America is filling a gap on the ground for us. It was a challenge. We want more stories, but there is a void. We don't know if this is the right solution, but it's working. And I wanted to highlight for those that are listening that yes, there are gaps, but there's different ways you can go about testing it. And Report for America has been a great way for us to test how do we create more volume and producing more solution stories when there aren't enough reporters to do it. Report for America is proving to be a good asset for us in that challenge.
Great. Speaking of challenges, one thing that I think maybe some folks on the call or the folks that we've definitely met in some of these local regions and that I'm sure you all have met is they are overstudied. They're saying, okay, you're doing all these studies and what are you doing about the work? I think that we really want people to listen, like you said, Lamont and Molly, but how do you balance kind of doing this type of listening, studying work with taking action and kind of trying to make things happen? Both Molly, Fiona, Lamont, anyone that want to jump in on that?
I believe Molly and Fiona are currently muted, Teresa.
Okay. You can act it out, maybe.
So I would just say, that's a really good point. And you're talking about community members feeling like they're being studied, but they're not really seeing the results of that. Is that what you're asking about?
I think there's a lot of layers. I think there's community members, and then we definitely hear from, the news field. They're saying, oh, we've been part of so many conversations. Why don't we just get some?
Yeah, unfortunately, philanthropy moves really slowly, right? Philanthropy does not have the urgency that it should have. So You know, one of the things that I think is really important at all those different levels, whether it's, you know, doing a bunch of research with news organizations or doing a bunch of research with community members, is like being really intentional about closing the loop, right? Where you not only report back about what you heard, but report back about either what you're going to do or how you or what action you did take, right? Because if you're not closing that loop, then you're all then of course you're always going to have people say, well, what the heck did I spend all my time, like I have no idea how you even used any of that information, and that was a waste of my time. And so closing that loop, I think, is incredibly important. And just being communicative all along the way about what your intentions are, I think, is also valuable for building trust along the way.
As it relates to, you know, conversation fatigue, I think it's universal. And I think the reporting fatigue that our people are experiencing has a lot to do with the severity of the situation. We're talking about the ecosystem of media and journalism. It's a very important function of society. And so, from a funder perspective, I believe the reporting is putting people in a position to make sure that the actions that they're going to fund and take are deliberate and not contributing more harm to what's already being experienced in the field. And so I think at any moment we have the opportunity to engage with someone in the conversation, that we share with them the why this reporting is so important, the why they are experiencing conversation and reporting fatigue. We all are. Not only the journalists, not only communities, not only the grantees, not only the funders, we're all experiencing this. We're hopeful that this sort of two-a-days, if you will, for those who have play sports, that training part, we're hopeful that, you know, once we get to, you know, hitting our stride, that we're able to do some with some efficiency, we're able to do some with fluidity, and that we're not creating more harm to the situation.
Yeah, amen to both of those insights and from both of you. And I would add that when I do local news ecosystem assessments, I'm really mindful of that issue that you raised, Teresa, about both the folks that are making journalism and especially the folks in the community are really, really tired of talking and being asked and being poked and prodded, and in some cases researched. And you'll hear that fatigue when you talk to them. And so part of what I try to do is acknowledge that and look at, especially if you're a funder and you've already been engaged in your community, you've already done some kind of assessment. It may not have been about news or media, but maybe it's been about public health. Maybe it's been about income inequality or housing. Take all of that and look at that and pull that into the body of research and go back to the folks that you talk to and say, we're looking at this, we really appreciate your time, and we are not, this isn't just like we took up your time and we did this thing and we put that on the shelf and now we're starting fresh again on this whole other project. This is all cumulative, it's contiguous. And so I think the way to think about it is you've helped us identify that these things are important. You've helped us surface these possible solutions, and you've helped us develop. This is about developing leadership, right? And so it's not just about developing leadership among people in the media, it's about developing leadership in the community and what role does local news play in that. So another thing is just like a super concrete thing, which is paying people for their time. So one thing that I did with a big, large-scale assessment that I did for a couple of foundations that pulled their resources was we paid focus group participants in a very low-income area $100 for their 2 hours of their time, which, I mean, that's like worth showing up for, right? And it's an acknowledgement that we're not just going to extract from you, your expertise is vital to what we're doing, and respecting that. And then also, as Molly said, on top of that, trying to reflect back to them, here's what we heard, here's what we're doing, here's what we'll keep in touch. And I think for funders that are doing this work, it can be hard to strike that balance when you don't know yet what you're going to do. You have your own internal processes to work out, maybe within your board and your staff, and what can you commit to. But if you can just incrementally say, here's why we're doing this, here's what we heard, we want to know more. I think the Colorado Media Project has done a phenomenal job of that, because they keep on communicating with their newsletter, with public events. And so identifying leadership, even we identified leaders in that community through the focus groups. We said, wow, these people right here, these individuals are people we want to invite back. And so when there was a subsequent meeting to talk about news, we had people, they're not necessarily folks, some of them did actually have journalism backgrounds, but some of them didn't. But we brought them in and put them at the table at equal footing with the editors and publishers from these outlets.
+1 to all those things. Yeah, we've definitely found how important communication is. And I mean, much less eloquently, often tell folks to kind of build in some quick wins. So think about what you can be doing. Just that's a small thing, but that could have great impact. Molly actually has written a lot about how small grants can make a big impact and allow for experimentation. And I think that's a great point too. We have gotten a question from Lucia, and if you want to add more details to that question, please do. But Lucia asked if folks on the call have any advice for grantees as well. I'm guessing in terms of what navigating kind of foundations when they're doing this type of work, but please definitely add more details into the chat box if you have them. But anyone want to share any kind of general advice for grantees in terms of this work? Fiona? Oh.
Thank you.
Sure.
We're figuring this out. Yeah, I think the toolkit that we produce here is really designed for anyone to use. We had in mind local funders and place-based funders, but anybody can do this work. And I think if you do this kind of assessment and then you make it available and you talk about why you did it, and like I said, you tailor it however you like. If what you want to do is look at other kinds of media that are in your ecosystem, if what you want to do is look at what your media market looks like and representation, like what's the demographics versus where are the outlets, that sort of thing. You can do it as you like. And I think sharing that, then you become one of the places that you become a conversation starter and a conversation host about this work. And I think everyone will find value in that, including, people that would support your work financially, whether it's a funder or a donor, quite frankly.
Good point. So one question Lamont?
Yeah. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So any advice for grantees? And, it's a very open-ended question, so I'm just going to make a few assumptions and just give some feedback. And I'm assuming any advice for grantees who are wanting to have a conversation with a funder on how they might deepen that conversation for potential funding or support. I'll make that assumption. And I believe one of the things that I would advise grantees to, in that process is to remain authentic. You know your product way better than the funder knows the product. Remain authentic, bring that passion forward, and then start to create around the surface edges of those things any baseline indicators, any sort of metrics, any sort of indicator points saying if we do these sets of things, which I'm proposing to you, we could then look back and say we've accomplished A, B, and C, and as a result, the community is in a better position to do this. That kind of conversation really eases the atmosphere in that conversation. But the most important is being authentic and bringing that passion forward, and not necessarily reinventing oneself in order to fit the profile of the person in which you're having a conversation with.
Anything else to add?
Nope.
Okay, great. I think someone's raising their hand, so we're going to experiment with letting someone ask a question on audio. So let's see if that works. Lisa, do you have a question or want to share something?
I do. Hi.
Hi.
It's nice to see some familiar faces here. This is Lisa Williams from WGBH News, and we figured out a way to sort of engage with our audience and figure out what they knew almost by accident. We actually started a series of weekly news quizzes, which were really popular with the audience and a great way for us to get newsletter subscribers, because they could get something if they dropped their email address at the end. But we noticed that our audience was flunking particular topics again and again. We weren't really doing a good job at informing them on things, and it was notable that the things that they were not getting the answers right on were actually civics questions. And so out of that, we actually are doing a sort of civics explainer series of social videos aimed at the questions that apparently we are not doing a good job at informing them about. So sometimes we discover engagement opportunities almost by accident. Like the folks who are doing our news quiz are doing it for fun on their phone at lunchtime, you know, but they're also teaching us about what they're paying attention to and how good of a job we're doing.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. So was there a moment when you all kind of were like, okay, we actually should use this? Or was it just?
I started to notice patterns in their responses. It's something that we do every week. It's a popular feature. It's something that we did partially because we had a hole in terms of like, geez, what are we going to put on Facebook over the weekend? You know, we were trying to solve a really sort of low-level, pragmatic news hole problems for ourselves. But then we started to sort of reach out to people who had emailed us. We made a special segment of people who were, you know, responders to the news quiz, so that they got special versions of our email newsletter that specifically responded to their questions, right? The questions that they had about, we allowed them to start essentially asking questions of us. We started to let the quiz become kind of a two-way thing, right? So sometimes these kinds of things can happen organically. I love the idea of doing focus groups, and I hope that I can convince my newsroom to do some, in part because one of the big audiences that I have to engage is people who work in the newsroom. You know, the problem isn't disengagement from the audience, it's busy, overworked reporters and editors who don't necessarily see the value of that kind of work. But if I can convince them to get in the room with like actual real people who are going to a focus group, usually with food, that works on the reporters as well. It changes how they're thinking about things. And that's something I'm very interested in. I'm interested in sort of structural change in how the newsroom works so that we're doing a better job at actually serving the audience rather than just chasing the next story. I don't really think we're going to get where we're going by just chasing the next article, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I won't go into detail, but I think one of that really connects with a few of the examples in the toolkit about like, sometimes this can be fun. I mean, some of the people doing this have been doing just happy hours, or I think like scavenger hunts, or different ways of thinking about this. This doesn't have to be a slog. It can be really engaging and interesting. Not that any of this is a slog at all, but and I see Molly raising her hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. Nice to hear from you. So I think what's really an interesting point about what you raise is, you know, I think we get asked a lot, like, how do you measure success? How do you measure impact? And one of the this is going to sound overly simplistic, and please know that I know that this is not as easy as it sounds. But I mean, I find a very useful framework as like working backward, having a crystal clear mission and working backwards from that, right? So Dick Toffel at ProPublica wrote this paper on impact quite a while ago and laid it out very carefully and basically said, I'm just going to like really oversimplify it, but basically if you're let's say you're an investigative reporting news outlet and your mission is to change, right? You're trying to change the injustice that you see in the world, then you have to ask yourself, are things changing as a result of our work? And similarly, if your mission is to inform, which a lot of news outlets would say that their mission is to inform, you actually also have to ask yourself, are people more informed as a result of our work? And I think what you're saying, Lisa, that's so important is you discovered that actually people aren't more informed as a result of your work, and you're working to fix that. And that's really, really important. And also I really appreciate that you're willing to tackle that, and that you're not, it's a scary thing to ask yourself. Like, I mean, I understand why a lot of organizations don't ask themselves these questions, besides the fact that they're resource intensive, they can be resource intensive to answer these questions. It's also just scary to ask the question of, does my work make a difference, right? And so a lot of organizations really shy away from it and sort of hide behind, oh, we can't measure that. And I just think you gave a really perfect example of how you gathered data points along the way, and you're working really hard to fix those issues that you're seeing. So bravo for that example.
Yeah, thank you. And I think folks in the general chat might not be able to see Lisa's comment. She shared, if our mission is help people be better informed so they can make good decisions about their lives, communities, nation, then what? And I'd actually connect that to why we think funding news and information is important, and because it really connects to all these other issues. I'm realizing actually that we're almost out of time, which is crazy. I thought that we could just talk for hours and hours. But I'm really glad that we were able to get to some questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, but this is just the beginning, or not even the beginning. We're in the middle of a lot of this work. And I'm really thrilled to be sharing this with you and have this conversation. Please check out the toolkit. Email us at localnewslab@democracyfund.org with more questions. We'll be sharing more, but there's lots of other folks that have more resources too. So we're always happy to connect and make those connections and have these conversations. I guess I'll leave it with our panel. Lamont, Molly, Fiona, is there anything that you want to leave us with?
I want to quickly try and, at minimum, acknowledge Mike's question about local governments. And Mike, that's a fantastic question. I believe that is the evolution of this body of work, to be able to, I talked earlier about on-ramps. There's also an on-ramp for local governments at the local level, state level, and also at the national level. Part of this work is designed to be able to bring cohesion around a set of problem solutions, and then be in a position to present those to the branches of government, so that they too can see what is being tested out on the ground, and so that they can have a better understanding of how their decision-making process as it relates to policy can have an impact at the local level. So Mike, yes, that is the evolution of the work. But the first step was to be able to make sure that we were creating these holistic ecosystems.
Yeah, I would add to that. Absolutely. I often talk to folks in government when I'm doing stakeholder interviews. They're often at the table when we do these engagement conversations. And I think because if you're putting people at the center, how do they get information? Some of what they get is information from the government, from the city council or the public health department. And that needs to be part of the mix. It's not to say the government officials are the ones replacing traditional journalism. And this is really important part of the ecosystem mindset, is that we're actually talking about, not sometimes reporting isn't the only thing that people need, right? But all that government information is an input to reporting. Sometimes it's part of the mix of information that people get. And so I think that we could have a whole webinar on the role of local governments in this conversation. So thank you for raising that. And also thank you, Mike Wassenaar, for all the work that you do with public access media and trying to hold on to that. A lot of what I just want to put a shout out that absolutely include public access in and community radio when you're thinking about those things, because those are vital assets. A lot of what we talk about when we say we want local engagement and responsive media that gives access to people in the community to make media and tell their stories, we actually have that, and we may not have it forever if we don't become aware of it and start defending it. So I just appreciate everything that you do.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Molly, anything to leave us with?
Oh gosh, don't put that pressure on me. No, I mean, I also want to share my thanks for Mike's question and also his contributions to the field, and also everybody who was on this. I noticed that Tasneem Raja at the Tyler Loop was also on this call, and she's done incredible work too. There's actually so much reason to feel so hopeful and optimistic about the people who are doing the work on the ground, and I find so much joy in that. So there are so many bright spots for us to look for in all of our local places. And I agree with you from the very beginning, Teresa, it's not all doom and gloom.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you again, Lamont, Molly, Fiona, and everyone that joined us. We'll be talking more. So let's have hope together. Thank you all so much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You.